Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly. I am Pembroke and this is part 11. Florus the procurator has plundered the temple treasury, and when the people mock his greed he looses his soldiers on Jerusalem. The princess Bernice herself goes barefoot to beg him to stop, and is jeered for her pains. As the city teeters, Cestius the governor of Syria sends the Tribune Neopolitanus to see how matters truly stand, and King Agrippa, desperate to hold the people back from the cliff's edge, mounts a roof and delivers the longest speech in all the book, a tour of the whole Roman world, nation by conquered nation, to prove that to fight Rome is to choose suicide. Let us continue.
About the same time King Agrippa was going to Alexandria to congratulate Alexander on having received the government of Egypt from Nero. But Agrippa's sister Bernice had come to Jerusalem, and when she saw the wicked conduct of the soldiers, she was deeply distressed. She repeatedly sent the masters of her horse and her guards to Florus, begging him to stop these slaughters. But he would not grant her request. He paid no regard either to the great number already killed or to the nobility of the woman who interceded, but only to the profit he could make from the plundering. Indeed, the violence of the soldiers broke out into such madness that it was directed even against the queen herself. They did not only torment and destroy those they had caught before her very eyes, they would have killed her too, if she had not escaped by fleeing to the palace and staying there all night with her guards, whom she kept around her because she feared an attack from the soldiers. At that time she was living in Jerusalem in order to fulfill a vow she had made to God. It is usual for those who have been afflicted with disease or other distresses to make vows, and for 30 days before they offer their sacrifices, they abstain from wine and shave the hair of their heads. Bernice was now performing these things. She stood barefoot before Florus's tribunal and begged him to spare the Jews. Yet she could obtain no reverence for herself, nor could she escape without danger of being killed. This happened on the 16th day of the month Artemisius or Jar. On the next day, the multitude, in great agony, ran together to the upper market-place and made the loudest lamentations for those who had died. Most of their cries were accusations against Florus. The men of power and the high priests were frightened by this. They tore their garments, fell down before each group, and begged them to stop, and not to provoke Florus into some incurable action beyond what they had already suffered. The multitude immediately complied, both out of reverence for those who asked it of them, and because they hoped Florus would do them no further harm. Florus was troubled that the disturbances were over, and he tried to kindle the flame again. He sent for the high priests and the other eminent men, and said that the only proof that the people would make no further innovations would be for them to go out and meet the soldiers coming up from Caesarea, from which 2 cohorts were arriving. While these men were exhorting the multitude to do this, Florus sent ahead and instructed the centurions of the cohorts to tell the soldiers under them not to return the Jews' greetings. If the Jews made any reply against Florus, the soldiers were to use their weapons. The high priests then assembled the multitude in the temple and urged them to go meet the Romans and greet the cohorts very civilly before their miserable situation became incurable. The seditious part would not agree to these persuasions, and the thought of those who had already been destroyed made them lean toward those who were boldest for action. At this time every priest and every servant of God brought out the holy vessels and the ornamental garments in which they used to minister in sacred things. The harpers and singers of hymns also came out with their musical instruments, fell down before the multitude, and begged them to preserve those holy ornaments for them, and not provoke the Romans to carry off those sacred treasures. One could also see the high priests themselves with dust sprinkled heavily on their heads, and their chests uncovered except for torn garments. They appealed to each of the eminent men by name, and to the multitude as a whole, asking them not to betray their country over a small offense to men who wanted to lay it waste. They asked what benefit it would bring the soldiers to receive a greeting from the Jews, or what improvement it would bring their own affairs if they did not now go out to meet them. If they greeted the soldiers civilly, every opportunity for Florus to begin a war would be cut off. By doing this they would gain safety for their country and freedom from further sufferings. Besides, it would show a great lack of self-control if they yielded to a few seditious persons, when it was more fitting for so great a people to compel those others to act soberly. By these persuasions, which they used on both the multitude and the seditious, they restrained some by threats and others by the reverence paid to them. After this they led the people out. They met the soldiers quietly, and in a composed manner, and when they came up to them, they greeted them. But when the soldiers made no answer, the seditious cried out against Florus. This was the signal that had been given for the attack. The soldiers immediately surrounded them and struck them with clubs. As the Jews fled, the horsemen trampled them down. Many fell dead from the blows of the Romans, and even more from their own violence in crushing one another. There was a terrible crowding around the gates. As everyone tried to get ahead of everyone else, the flight of them all was delayed, and there was dreadful destruction among those who fell. They were suffocated and broken to pieces by the multitude above them. Their own relatives could not identify them in order to care for their burial. The soldiers, too, fell upon those they overtook and beat them without mercy. They drove the multitude through the place called Bezetha, forcing their way so they could enter and seize the temple and the tower Antonia. Florus, also wanting to get those places into his possession, brought those who were with him out of the king's palace, and would have forced his way as far as the citadel Antonia. But his attempt failed. People immediately turned back against him and stopped the violence of his attack. Standing on the tops of their houses, they threw darts at the Romans. The Romans were badly hurt by this, because the weapons came from above, and they could not force a passage through the multitude, which blocked the narrow streets. So they withdrew to the camp at the palace. The seditious were afraid that Florus might come again and gain possession of the temple through Antonia. So they immediately climbed onto those cloisters of the temple that joined Antonia and cut them down. This cooled the greed of Florus. He had been eager to obtain the treasures of God in the temple, and for that reason he wanted to get into Antonia. But as soon as the cloisters were broken down, he abandoned his attempt. He then sent for the high priests and the Sanhedrim and told them that he himself was leaving the city, but that he would leave them as large a garrison as they wanted. They promised that they would make no innovations if he left them one band, but not the band that had fought with the Jews, because the multitude hated that band because of what they had suffered from it. So he changed the band as they desired, and with the rest of his forces returned to Caesarea. Florus contrived another way to force the Jews to begin the war. He said to Cestius, and falsely accused the Jews of revolting from the Roman government. He blamed them for beginning the former fight and pretended that they had been the authors of the disturbance, though in fact they had only suffered in it. But the governors of Jerusalem were not silent on this occasion. They themselves wrote to Cestius, as Bernice also did, about the illegal actions Florus had committed against the city. When Cestius read both accounts, he consulted with his captains about what he should do. Some of them thought it best for Cestius to go up with his army, either to punish the revolt if it was real, or if the Jews remained quiet under the Romans, to place Roman affairs on a firmer foundation. But Cestius himself thought it best to send one of his close friends ahead to examine the state of affairs and give him a faithful account of the Jews' intentions. Accordingly, he sent one of his tribunes, named Neopolitanus. Neopolitanus met King Agrippa at Jamnia as Agrippa was returning from Alexandria, and told him who had sent him and on what business he had been sent. There the high priests, the powerful men among the Jews, and the Sanhedrim came to congratulate the king on his safe return. After they had paid him their respects, they lamented their own calamities and told him what barbarous treatment they had suffered from Florus. Agrippa was greatly indignant at this cruelty, but in a subtle way he turned his anger toward the Jews whom he truly pitied. He did this to beat down their proud thoughts of themselves, and to make them believe they had not been treated so unjustly, so that he might dissuade them from avenging themselves. These great men, having better understanding than the rest and desiring peace because of the possessions they had, understood that the rebuke the king gave them was meant for their good. As for the people, they came 60 furlongs out from Jerusalem and congratulated both Agrippa and Neopolitanus. But the wives of those who had been slain ran out first of all, lamenting. When the people heard their mourning, they also fell into lamentation and begged Agrippa to help them. They cried out to Neopolitanus as well, complaining of the many miseries they had endured under Florus. When they came into the city, they showed him how the marketplace had been made desolate and the houses plundered. Then, through Agrippa, they persuaded Neopolitanus to walk around the city with only one servant, as far as Siloam, so that he might learn for himself that the Jews submitted to all the other Romans, and were displeased only with Florus because of his excessive barbarity toward them. So he walked around and gained sufficient experience of the good temper of the people. Then he went up to the temple, called the multitude together, highly commended them for their faithfulness to the Romans, and earnestly exhorted them to keep the peace. After performing at the temple such parts of divine worship as he was allowed to perform, he returned to Cestius. The multitude of the Jews then addressed themselves to the king and the high priests, asking permission to send ambassadors to Nero against Florus. They did not want, by remaining silent, to allow any suspicion that they themselves had caused the great slaughters that had been made or that they were disposed to revolt. They argued that they would seem to have been the first beginners of the war unless they prevented the report by showing who had actually begun it. It was openly clear that they would not be quiet if anyone hindered them from sending such an embassy. Agrippa thought it too dangerous for them to appoint men to go as accusers of Florus. Yet he also did not think it proper to neglect them while they were in a disposition for war. Therefore he called the multitude together into a large gallery. He placed his sister Bernice in the house of the Assamanians so that she could be seen by them. That house stood above the gallery, at the passage to the upper city, where the bridge joined the temple to the gallery. Then he spoke to them as follows. If I had perceived that all of you were zealously determined to go to war with the Romans, and that the purer and more sincere part of the people did not intend to live in peace, I would not have come out to you or been so bold as to give you counsel. Speeches meant to persuade men to do what they ought are useless when the hearers have already agreed to do the opposite. But some are eager for war because they are young and have no experience of the miseries it brings. Some desire it from an unreasonable expectation of recovering liberty. Others hope to profit from it, and are therefore passionately bent on it, so that in the confusion of your affairs they may seize what belongs to those too weak to resist them. For this reason, I thought it proper to gather you all together and tell you what I think is for your advantage, so that the former may grow wiser and change their minds, and so that the best men may not be harmed by the bad conduct of others. Let no one raise a tumult against me if what he hears me say does not please him. Those who admit no cure and are resolved on revolt will still have the power to keep the same opinions after my exhortation is over. But my speech will fail even for those who are willing to hear me unless you all keep silence. I know well that many of you make tragic outcries about the injuries your procurators have done you, and about the glorious advantages of liberty. But before I examine who you are that must go to war, and who they are against whom you must fight, I will first separate the pretenses that some of you have joined together. If your aim is to avenge yourselves on those who have injured you, why do you pretend that this is a war to recover liberty? But if you think all servitude intolerable, what purpose is served by your complaint against particular governors? Even if they treated you moderately, it would still be equally unworthy to live in servitude. Consider the several possible cases, and how little reason there is for you to go to war. Your first occasion is the accusations you have against your procurators. In this matter you ought to be submissive to those in authority, and not provoke them. When you reproach men greatly for small offenses, you stir up those you reproach to become your adversaries. This only makes them stop hurting you privately and with some modesty, and instead lay waste what you have openly. Nothing so much dulls the force of blows as bearing them with patience, and the quietness of those who are injured turns injurious people away from afflicting them. But let us suppose that the Roman ministers are injurious to you and incurably severe. Still, it is not all the Romans who injure you, nor has Caesar, against whom you are about to make war, injured you. No wicked governor is sent to you by their command. Those who are in the west cannot see those in the east, and indeed it is not easy for them even to hear what is done in these parts. It is absurd to make war on many people for the sake of one man, to make war on so mighty a people for a small cause, and that when these people are not able to know what you complain of. The crimes we complain of may soon be corrected, for the same procurator will not continue forever, and it is likely that his successors will come with more moderate inclinations. But once war has begun, it is not easily laid down again, nor can it be borne without bringing calamities with it. As for the desire to recover your liberty, it is too late to indulge it now. You ought to have worked earnestly long ago, so that you might never have lost it. The first experience of slavery was hard to endure, and the struggle not to become subject to it would have been just. But a slave who has once been brought into subjection, and then runs away, is a refractory slave rather than a lover of liberty. The proper time to do everything possible so that you might never admit the Romans into your city was when Pompey first came into the country. But our ancestors and their kings, who were in far better circumstances than we are in money, strong bodies, and valiant souls, did not withstand the onset of a small part of the Roman army. Yet you, who have now accustomed yourselves to obedience from one generation to another, and who are so much inferior in your circumstances to those who first submitted, will venture to oppose the whole empire of the Romans. The Athenians once set fire to their own city in order to preserve the liberty of Greece. They pursued Xerxes, that proud prince who sailed upon the land and walked upon the sea, who could not be contained by the seas, but led an army too broad for Europe. They made him flee like a fugitive in a single ship, and broke so great a part of Asia at the Lesser Salamis. Yet even the Athenians are now servants to the Romans, and the commands sent from Italy become laws to the chief ruling city of Greece. The Lacedaemonians also, who won the great victories at Thermopylae and Plataea, who had Agesilaus for their king and searched every corner of Asia, are content to accept the same lords. The Macedonians still imagine what great men their Philip and Alexander were, and remember that Alexander had promised them rule over the world. Yet they endure so great a change and obey those whom fortune has advanced in their place. There are 10,000 other nations that had greater reason than we have to claim full liberty, and yet they submit. You alone think it a disgrace to be servants to those to whom the whole world has submitted. What sort of army do you rely on? What weapons do you depend on? Where is your fleet that may seize the Roman seas? Where are the treasures sufficient for your undertakings? Do you suppose, I ask you, that you are going to make war with Egyptians and Arabians? Will you not carefully reflect on the Roman Empire? Will you not measure your own weakness? Has your army not often been beaten even by your neighboring nations, while the power of the Romans is invincible in every part of the inhabited earth? Rather, they still seek something beyond it. The Euphrates is not a sufficient boundary for them on the east, nor the Danube on the north. For their southern limit, they have searched Libya as far as uninhabited countries, and Cadiz is their limit on the west. Indeed, they have sought another inhabited world beyond the ocean, and have carried their arms as far as British islands that were never known before. What then do you pretend? Are you richer than the Gauls, stronger than the Germans, wiser than the Greeks, more numerous than all men in the inhabited earth? What confidence raises you up to oppose the Romans? Perhaps it will be said that slavery is hard to endure. Yes, but how much harder is it for the Greeks, who were regarded as the noblest people under the sun? Though they inhabit a large country, they are subject to 6 bundles of Roman rods. The same is true of the Macedonians, who have a more just reason to claim liberty than you do. What is the condition of the 500 cities of Asia? Do they not submit to a single governor and to the consular bundle of rods? Why should I speak of the Henlaci, the Colchi, the nation of Tauri, those who inhabit the Bosphorus, and the nations around Pontus and Meotis, who formerly did not even know a lord of their own, but are now subject to 3,000 armed men, while 40 long ships keep peace on a sea that was formerly unnavigable and very stormy? How strong a plea for liberty could Bithynia, Cappadocia, the people of Pamphylia, the Latians, and the Cilicians put forward, and yet they are made tributary without an army? What are the circumstances of the Thracians? Their country extends 5 days' journey in breadth and 7 in length. It is of a far harsher nature and far more defensible than yours, and by the severity of its cold is sufficient to keep armies from attacking it. Do they not submit to 2,000 men of the Roman garrisons? Are not the Illyrians, who inhabit the adjoining country as far as Dalmatia and the Danube, governed by only 2 legions, which also stop the incursions of the Daeans? As for the Dalmatians, who have made such frequent insurrections to regain their liberty, and who could never before be so thoroughly subdued that they did not always gather their forces and revolt again, they are now very quiet under 1 Roman legion. Great advantages might provoke any people to revolt, and the Gauls might best do it, since they are so thoroughly walled around by nature. On the east by the Alps, on the north by the river Rhine, on the south by the Pyrenean mountains, and on the west by the ocean. Although these Gauls have such barriers before them to prevent any attack, and although they have no fewer than 305 nations among them, and one may say, the fountains of domestic happiness within themselves, sending plentiful streams of prosperity over almost the whole world, they endure being tributary to the Romans and derive their prosperous condition from them. They undergo this not because their minds are soft or because they are of ignoble stock, since they endured a war of 80 years to preserve their liberty, but because of the great regard they have for the power of the Romans and their good fortune, which is more effective than their arms. These Gauls are kept in servitude by 1,200 soldiers, hardly as many as their cities. Nor has the gold dug from the mines of Spain been sufficient to support a war for liberty, nor could their vast distance from the Romans by land and sea do it. The martial tribes of the Lusitanians and Spaniards could not escape, nor could the ocean with its tide, which was terrible to the ancient inhabitants. The Romans have extended their arms beyond the Pillars of Hercules, walked among the clouds on the Pyrenean mountains, and subdued these nations. 1 legion is enough to guard these people, though they were so hard to conquer and are so far from Rome. Who among you has not heard of the great number of the Germans? You have surely often seen yourselves that they are strong and tall, since the Romans have them everywhere among their captives. Yet these Germans, who live in an immense country, whose minds are greater than their bodies, whose souls despise death, and whose rage is fiercer than wild beasts, have the Rhine as the boundary of their enterprises and are tamed by 8 Roman legions. Those of them who were taken captive became the Roman servants, and the rest of the whole nation had to save themselves by flight. You who depend on the walls of Jerusalem should also consider what a wall the Britons had. The Romans sailed away to them and subdued them, though they were surrounded by the ocean, and lived on an island no smaller than the inhabited continent. 4 legions are enough to guard so large an island. Why should I say much more about this, when the Parthians, that most warlike body of men, lords of so many nations and surrounded by such mighty forces, send hostages to the Romans? By this you may see, if you wish, even in Italy, the noblest nation of the East submitting under the appearance of peace to serve them. When almost all people under the sun submit to the Roman arms, will you be the only people to make war against them? Will you do this without considering the fate of the Carthaginians, who, in spite of their boasts about the great Hannibal and the nobility of their Phoenician origin, fell by the hand of Scipio? The Cyrenians, descended from the Lacedaemonians, could not stop Roman valor. Nor could the Marmorite, a nation stretching as far as regions uninhabitable for lack of water. Nor could the Ceots, a place terrible even to hear described. Nor the Nasamons and Moors, nor the immense multitude of the Numidians. As for the third part of the inhabited earth, Africa, whose nations are so many that they are not easy to count, bounded by the Atlantic Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and feeding an innumerable multitude of Ethiopians as far as the Red Sea, the Romans have entirely subdued it. Besides the yearly fruits of the earth, which maintain the multitude of Romans for 8 months of the year, it also pays every kind of tribute and provides revenues suited to the needs of the government. Nor do they, like you, consider such commands a disgrace, although only 1 Roman legion remains among them. What occasion is there to show you the power of the Romans over distant countries, when it is so easy to learn it from Egypt, which is near you? That country stretches as far as the Ethiopians and Arabia the Happy and borders on India. It has 7,500,000 men, not counting the inhabitants of Alexandria, as can be learned from the revenue of the poll tax. Yet it is not ashamed to submit to the Roman government, though Alexandria is a great temptation to revolt because it is so full of people and wealth, and is also extremely large, 30 furlongs in length and no less than 10 in breadth. It pays more tribute to the Romans in 1 month than you do in a year. Besides what it pays in money, it sends grain to Rome that supports the city for 4 months of the year. Egypt is also walled around on every side, either by almost impassable deserts, or by seas without harbors, or by rivers, or by lakes. Yet none of these things has proved too strong for Roman good fortune. 2 legions stationed in that city are a bridle both for the more distant parts of Egypt and for the regions inhabited by the more noble Macedonians. Where, then, are the people who are to be your allies? Must they come from the uninhabited parts of the world? For all who live in the inhabited earth are under the Romans, unless some of you stretch your hopes beyond the Euphrates and suppose that those of your own nation who live in Adiabene will come to your aid. But certainly they will not entangle themselves in an unjustifiable war. And even if they followed such bad advice, the Parthians would not allow them to do it, because it is in their interest to maintain the truce between themselves and the Romans. They would be thought to break their covenants if anyone under their government marched against the Romans. What remains, then, is that you turn to divine assistance. But this too is already on the side of the Romans, for it is impossible that so vast an empire should have been established without God's providence. Consider how impossible it will be for you to preserve your zealous observance of your religious customs, which are hard to observe even when you fight against those whom you are able to conquer. How can you most of all hope for God's assistance when, by being forced to transgress his law, you will make him turn his face from you? If you observe the custom of the Sabbath days and refuse to do anything on them, you will easily be taken, as your forefathers were by Pompey, who was busiest in his siege on those days when the besieged rested. But if in time of war you transgress the law of your country, I cannot tell for whose sake you will afterward be fighting. Your one concern is to do nothing against any of your forefathers' customs. How then will you call on God to help you when you are voluntarily transgressing against his religion? All men who go to war do so depending either on divine assistance or on human assistance. Since your going to war will cut off both kinds of help, those who choose war choose evident destruction. What prevents you from killing your children and wives with your own hands and burning this most excellent native city of yours? By that mad action, you would at least escape the reproach of being beaten. But it would be best, my friends, it would be best, while the vessel is still in harbor, to foresee the coming storm and not sail out of the port into the middle of the hurricanes. We justly pity those who fall into great misfortunes without foreseeing them, but the man who rushes into obvious ruin earns reproach instead of compassion. Surely no one can imagine that you can enter a war by agreement, or that when the Romans have you in their power, they will use you moderately. Rather, as an example to other nations, they will burn your holy city and utterly destroy your whole nation. Those of you who survive the war will not be able to find a place to flee, since all men either already have the Romans as their lords or fear they will have them hereafter. The danger does not concern only the Jews who live here, but also those who live in other cities. There is no people on the inhabited earth who do not have some portion of you among them. If you go to war, your enemies will kill them also on that account. Thus every city that has Jews in it will be filled with slaughter for the sake of a few men, and those who kill them will be pardoned. But if such slaughter is not committed by them, consider how wicked it is to take arms against people who are so kind to you. Therefore have pity, if not on your children and wives, then on this metropolis of yours and its sacred walls. Spare the temple and preserve the holy house, with its holy furniture, for yourselves. For if the Romans get you into their power, they will no longer abstain from them when their former abstinence has been repaid with such ingratitude. I call your sanctuary to witness, and the holy angels of God, and this country common to us all, that I have kept back nothing that is for your preservation. If you follow the advice you ought to follow, you will have the peace that will be common to you and to me. But if you indulge your passions, you will run the hazards from which I shall be free. When Agrippa had spoken in this way, both he and his sister wept. By their tears they restrained a great deal of the people's violence. Still, the people cried out that they would not fight against the Romans, but against Florus, because of what they had suffered through him. Agrippa replied that what they had already done was the behavior of people making war against the Romans. They had not paid the tribute due to Caesar, and they had cut off the cloisters of the temple from joining the Tower Antonia. Therefore, he said, they would prevent any occasion for revolt if they joined these together again and paid their tribute. The citadel did not now belong to Florus, and they were not to pay the tribute money to Florus.
And we will stop there, with Agrippa's great oration ended and ignored. For all his eloquence, the people will have their war. Next time, in Part 12, the sacrifices for Caesar are cut off and the breach with Rome is open. Manahem seizes the rock of Masada and marches into Jerusalem as a tyrant, and across the cities of the land Jew and Greek fall upon one another in reciprocal slaughter. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.